There is a document, a real document, captured by American forces on the island of Saipan in the summer of 1944 that was found in the field pack of a dead Japanese officer. It was a manual, a training manual, issued by the Imperial Japanese Army to its soldiers being sent to the Pacific. And inside that manual there was a passage that American military historians have quoted ever since. It said, in effect, if you encounter United States Marines, do not expect a conventional engagement. They do not fight as soldiers fight. They fight as though dying is something that happens to other people. I was one of those Marines. My name is Earl Thomas Mackay. I was born in 1924 in Beaufort, South Carolina, a town so close to Parris Island that you could hear the drill instructors on a still morning if the wind was right. I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in January of 1942, 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, at 17 years old, with my mother's signature on the consent form and a lie about my age that nobody looked too hard at. I went through boot camp at Parris Island. I deployed to the Pacific. I fought on Guadalcanal, on Peleliu, and on Okinawa. And in those 3 islands, across 3 years of war, I came to understand something about the nature of combat that I have spent the rest of my life trying to explain to people who weren't there. The Japanese soldier was not what American propaganda made him. He was not a fanatic stumbling blindly into death. He was not a primitive warrior too simple to understand modern warfare. He was disciplined, resourceful, ferociously brave, and trained to a standard that matched or exceeded anything the Western world produced. He fought in terrain that would have broken most armies. He endured conditions, heat, disease, starvation, isolation, that should have destroyed unit cohesion long before the fighting began. And he kept fighting. He kept fighting long after any rational military calculus said the battle was lost. And he hated fighting us. Not because we were better soldiers, though I believe, in the end, we were. Not because our equipment was superior, though in many respects it was. He hated fighting Marines because of something that had no entry in any tactical manual. Something that was built into us at Parris Island and reinforced by every engagement we survived. Something the Japanese military, with all its discipline and all its courage, could not fully account for in its planning. We did not stop, no matter what they threw at us, no matter how many of us went down, no matter how dark the night was, or how many of them came through the wire, or how long the ammunition had to last. The United States Marine Corps, in the Pacific theater of World War II, did not stop. And I want to tell you why, because the answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable, and it has nothing to do with the recruiting posters. It has to do with Parris Island. Boot camp in the United States Marine Corps in 1942 was not training. That word is insufficient. It was transformation, a deliberate, systematic, sometimes brutal process of taking a civilian human being and replacing everything soft in him with something that could function under conditions that would otherwise cause the mind to shut down. I arrived at Parris Island as a 17-year-old from South Carolina who had never been in a fight more serious than a schoolyard argument. 11 weeks later, I was something different. Not a better person, necessarily. A different kind of person. A person who had been methodically taught that his body's signals, pain, exhaustion, fear, were information, not commands. The drill instructors at Parris Island in 1942 were not educators. They were demolition experts. They took everything you believed about your own limits and they demolished it, and then they built something in the ruins. They ran us until men collapsed, and then they made the men who were still standing pick up the ones who had fallen and run further. They put us in situations designed to produce panic. Confined spaces, darkness, simulated artillery, the controlled chaos of a beach assault, and they made us function inside the panic rather than escape it. They taught us that the man next to you was the only thing in the world that mattered, that his survival was more important than your comfort, and that abandoning him for any reason was the one unforgivable sin in the Marine Corps Catechism. By the time I left Parris Island, I had a different relationship with my own fear than I had arrived with. Fear was still there. It never left, not on Guadalcanal, not on Peleliu, not on Okinawa. Anyone who tells you the fear goes away is either lying or was never in real combat. But fear had been moved. It had been relocated from the driver's seat to the passenger seat. It could inform me. It could not stop me. That is what Parris Island built. That is what the Japanese military, in all its careful planning, never fully calculated for. I shipped out for the Pacific in the late summer of 1942, bound for an island that most Americans had never heard of and would never forget. Guadalcanal, a dense, steaming, malarial hell in the Solomon Islands, where the heat was a physical weight, and the jungle was so thick that visibility dropped to 10 feet in the undergrowth, and the sounds of the island, birds, insects, rain, the distant surf, were indistinguishable at night from the sounds of men moving through vegetation with rifles. We landed at Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. The initial landing was almost unopposed. The Japanese garrison was small and fell back quickly. We took the airfield, which was the objective, and we dug in. And then, over the following weeks and months, as Japanese reinforcements poured onto the island via the route that sailors began calling the Tokyo Express, we learned what it actually meant to fight the Imperial Japanese Army in its element. The Japanese fought differently than any enemy American forces had faced in modern warfare. They were masters of camouflage, not just physical concealment, but the ability to become part of an environment so completely that they were invisible until the moment they chose not to be. I have watched men walk within 3 feet of a Japanese position and see nothing. I have seen positions discovered only because a man stumbled into them literally, physically stumbled over a rifle barrel or a boot. Their ability to construct defensive works, to turn a hillside or a tree line or a coral ridge into a fortification that could absorb direct artillery fire and still produce effective resistance, was, and I say this without reservation, extraordinary. And at night, they owned the jungle. The Japanese preferred night operations for reasons that were both tactical and psychological. Tactically, the darkness neutralized American firepower advantages. You cannot call in accurate air support or artillery on a target you cannot see. Psychologically, the darkness was a weapon in itself. They understood that fear and exhaustion compound each other in the dark, that a man who has been awake for 36 hours with his nerves compressed to breaking point will eventually begin to hear and see things that aren't there, and that a defender who opens fire on shadows gives away his position and exhausts his ammunition before dawn. They used noise, deliberate, controlled noise, to degrade our sleep and fray our nerves. They called out to us in English, sometimes in accented but comprehensible sentences, sometimes just our names if they had recovered dog tags from the dead. They rolled empty ration cans down hillsides to make us think an infiltration was beginning. They were sophisticated in their psychological warfare, in a way that I don't think has ever been fully appreciated in the histories I have read. But here is what they could not account for. Here is what the Japanese military, for all its sophistication, got wrong about the United States Marine Corps. We had been trained to be afraid and function anyway. Every trick in their psychological arsenal, the noise, the darkness, the calls in English, the manufactured uncertainty, every one of those tools worked on the nervous system of a normal human being in a predictable way. They worked on us too. We were not superhuman. We felt every bit of it. But we had spent 11 weeks at Parris Island being systematically exposed to fear and being required to perform inside it, and by the time we got to Guadalcanal, the performance had become automatic. The fear happened. The function continued. That is not bravery. I want to be precise about this, because I think the word bravery gets misapplied to combat situations in a way that actually obscures what happened. Bravery implies a conscious choice, a moment when you weigh the danger and decide to go forward anyway. What I am describing is something different. It is conditioning so deep that the choice is no longer conscious. The body acts before the mind has decided. The training takes over. And the Japanese, who understood courage as well as any warriors in history, did not know how to defeat conditioning. Let me tell you about Guadalcanal's most savage engagement, the Battle of the Tinaru River, though we called it different things and the river had a different name on most maps. August 21st, 1942. A Japanese force of perhaps 900 men under Colonel Ichiki Kiyonao attempted a frontal assault across a sandbar into our defensive position in the middle of the night. Colonel Ichiki had been told that the American Marines on Guadalcanal were a disorganized, demoralized force that would break under a determined night attack. He had been told this by intelligence officers who had not fought Marines. He launched his attack with confidence. What followed was one of the most complete destructions of an attacking force in Pacific War history. The Marines held their fire until the assault was fully committed across the sandbar, until the Japanese soldiers were in the water and unable to maneuver, and then opened up with everything: rifles, machine guns, artillery, eventually tanks brought up at first light to finish what the night had started. Of the 900 men who attacked that sandbar, fewer than 100 survived. Colonel Ichiki, according to accounts, burned his regimental colors and took his own life rather than report the failure to Imperial headquarters. I was not at the Tinaru. I was further along the perimeter that night, but I heard it. The sound of that engagement traveled through the jungle air in a way that made the ground tremble. And in the morning, I walked past the sandbar, and I saw what was left. I was 18 years old. I am 99 years old now, and I can still see it. Some things do not leave. The campaign on Guadalcanal lasted 6 months. By the time the Japanese evacuated the island in February of 1943, we had learned things about Pacific warfare that could not be learned any other way. We had learned the jungle. We had learned the night. We had learned that the Japanese soldier, wounded and surrounded and out of ammunition, would still fight, would use his bayonet, would use his hands, would use whatever remained, because surrender was not a concept that existed in his training the way it existed in ours. We respected this. You cannot fight an enemy for 6 months in conditions like those and not develop a respect, however complicated, for his commitment. But we also learned something about ourselves. We learned that the training was real. We learned that what Paris Island had built in us was not theater, not something that worked in exercises and collapsed under actual fire. It worked under actual fire. It worked at the Tinaru. It worked in the jungle night when the calls came from the darkness in English. It worked when men went down beside you, and you kept moving because stopping was not an option the Marine Corps had installed in you. After Guadalcanal came the long, grinding island-hopping campaign that would eventually reach Japan's doorstep, and then came Peleliu. If Guadalcanal was the war's education, Peleliu was its graduate school. The island of Peleliu in the Palau chain was small, roughly 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, and it contained more fortified defensive positions per square yard than any piece of ground American forces had yet encountered in the Pacific. The Japanese commander on Peleliu, General Inoue Sadai, had abandoned the traditional Japanese defensive doctrine of meeting the enemy at the waterline and throwing him back into the sea. He had replaced it with something new, something that had been developed in direct response to the American pattern of island assaults: defense in depth from underground. The coral ridges of Peleliu's interior, a formation called Umurbrogol, which the Marines would rename Bloody Nose Ridge, had been converted into an interlocking network of caves, bunkers, and tunnels that could shelter hundreds of men from naval bombardment, connected by underground corridors that allowed defenders to shift position, resupply, and reinforce without ever exposing themselves above ground. Each position was designed to support adjacent positions. Each cave covered the approaches to 2 or 3 others. Destroying one position did not open the next. It merely revealed the next defensive layer, equally fortified, equally prepared. The 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu on September 15, 1944. Command estimated the island would be secured in 4 days. It took 73. I landed on Peleliu on D-Day, I remember the ramp going down and the water coming up over my boots and the noise. The noise was so total, so all-encompassing, that individual sounds stopped being distinguishable. Artillery, naval gunfire, aircraft, the crack of rifles, the tearing sound of machine guns, the detonation of mortar rounds in the sand. It was not loud. Loud is a word for things that can be measured against silence. This had no relationship to silence. This was the sound of a world that had decided to tear itself apart. We pushed inland. The beach was cleared. The airfield, the tactical objective, was taken. And then we went into the ridges. Fighting in the Umar was unlike anything I had encountered on Guadalcanal. On Guadalcanal, the enemy came to us, often at night in the jungle. On Peleliu, we went to them, in daylight, up the face of coral ridges so sharp that moving across them in boots was a challenge without anyone shooting at you. The heat was extreme. Temperatures on the exposed coral regularly exceeded 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and the black rock absorbed and radiated heat with a ferocity that turned the ridgeline into something close to a furnace. Men suffered heat casualties alongside combat casualties. Water was a tactical problem as significant as ammunition. And from every cave mouth, from every rock crevice, from positions that were invisible until they fired, the Japanese defenders held. They had food. They had water, stored in cisterns deep in the coral. They had ammunition. They had, for the first time in the Pacific War, a defensive system designed not to stop the American assault on the beach, but to bleed it in the interior, to destroy American strength methodically, cave by cave and ridge by ridge, at a cost that Tokyo calculated would make the American public flinch from the final invasion of the home islands. I want to tell you about a specific day on Peleliu. I will not give you a date because I lost track of dates somewhere in the second week. When you haven't slept in 2 days and you have been in contact for 60 hours, and the man who was next to you this morning is not next to you anymore, dates become abstract. But I remember the day itself with perfect clarity. We were working a cave complex on the lower slope of Bloody Nose Ridge. The approach was a narrow coral defile, a natural channel between two rock faces that funneled movement into a killing zone approximately 40 yards long. We had already lost 2 men trying to cross that 40 yards. The cave mouth at the far end was invisible except when it fired, and when it fired low and sustained, the way a trained machine gunner fires when he has set his weapon in a position he has thought about carefully and prepared for exactly this. Our platoon commander, Lieutenant Briggs, was 23 years old and had been on the island for 11 days, which made him experienced by Peleliu standards. He looked at that defile for a long time. He looked at the 2 men we had lost. He looked at the remaining men in the platoon, and then he turned to a corporal named Washington Beaumont, a man from Georgia, enormous, so quiet in normal circumstances that you could forget he was there, and he said, "Beaumont, smoke and grenades, 40 seconds. Beaumont said, "Yes, sir." That was the entire conversation. What followed in the next 4 minutes I will not describe in full. I will say that Washington Beaumont crossed that defile, that the cave was neutralized, and that Beaumont was wounded twice in the process and was back on the line the following morning. I will say that the Japanese defenders in that cave, 4 men we found afterward, had prepared their position with a professionalism and care that, in different circumstances, would have deserved professional admiration. They had done everything correctly. And it was not enough, because Beaumont had been trained at Paris Island and he crossed the defile anyway. That is the story of Peleliu, repeated 10,000 times across 73 days. Cave by cave, ridge by ridge, men trained to a standard that made the impossible merely very difficult, advancing against men who had built the best defensive system in the Pacific War and were defending it with complete commitment to a cause that they believed with total sincerity was worth dying for. Both things were true simultaneously. The Japanese defenders of Peleliu were superb, and we took the island. After Peleliu came Okinawa in the spring of 1945, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War, and the last major island battle before the atomic bombs ended what the invasion of the Japanese home islands would have begun. By then, I was a staff sergeant. I had been in the Pacific for 3 years. I had buried friends on 3 islands. I was 20 years old, and I had the interior life of a much older and more exhausted man. Okinawa was different from everything that had come before in one significant respect: the civilians. Okinawa was not a military garrison like Peleliu. It was inhabited densely by a Ryukyuan people who were neither Japanese nor American and who found themselves trapped between 2 armies fighting the largest battle of the Pacific Campaign. The Japanese military had told the Okinawan civilians that American Marines would torture and kill them, that surrender meant worse than death. Thousands of civilians died as a result of this, caught in the crossfire, forced into cave complexes that became killing grounds, or, in terrible and heartbreaking cases, driven to suicide by a fear that propaganda had made absolute. I will tell you something that has stayed with me across the 80 years since Okinawa. In the late stages of the battle, our unit came across a group of Okinawan civilians sheltering in a natural cave complex on the southern end of the island. There were perhaps 40 of them, old men, women, children, a few teenagers. They had been in that cave for days. They were starving. They were terrified. And when we reached the cave entrance, they did not come out. They believed what they had been told. They believed we were there to kill them. It took 2 hours and a Japanese-American interpreter from our attached translation unit to convince the first person to emerge, an old woman. She came out with her hands raised, shaking so badly that she could barely stand. She looked at us, at these Marines who in the Japanese military narrative were monsters, and she saw men who were tired and dirty and young and who were not going to hurt her. The expression on her face when that realization arrived, I cannot describe it. I will not try. Some things the English language was not built to carry. Every civilian who emerged from that cave alive was a rebuke to the propaganda that had put them there. And standing at that cave entrance, watching them come out one by one, I felt something that combat had mostly stripped from me. I felt that the thing we were doing, the terrible, costly, grinding thing we had been doing for 3 years across 3 oceans of islands, was right. Not clean, not simple, not without cost that was almost beyond accounting, but right. Okinawa was secured in late June of 1945. The casualty figures were staggering on every side. American, Japanese, and Okinawan civilian losses combined made it the bloodiest battle of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese had fought with the same discipline and commitment I had encountered on Guadalcanal and Peleliu. They had fought from fortified positions. They had conducted night infiltrations. They had used every terrain advantage available. They had made the island cost what it cost. And they had still lost, for the same reason they had lost every island since Guadalcanal. Because there is a limit to what discipline and commitment can do against men who have been trained to keep moving no matter what happens, and who have internalized that training so deeply that it no longer requires a decision. I came home in the fall of 1945, Beaufort, South Carolina, the same town where I could hear the drill instructors at Paris Island on a still morning. I was 21 years old, and I had been to 3 of the most violent places on earth. I walked into my parents' house. My mother made biscuits. My father, who had fought in the First World War and understood things without being told, sat across the dinner table from me and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "You all right?" I said, "Yes, sir." It was not entirely true, but it was what you said. The adjustment back to civilian life was not simple, and I will not pretend it was. There were nights when the sounds were wrong, when a car backfiring or a thunderstorm reached places in my nervous system that a sound should not be able to reach. There were mornings when I woke up already calculating threat directions and fields of fire for a bedroom in South Carolina that contained no threats. The men I had served with, the ones who came home, most of them knew what I mean. We did not have a name for it in 1945. We called it the nerves. We called it being jumpy. We went to work and built lives and carried it quietly because that was what men did then, and because the people around us were so genuinely glad to have us back that burdening them with the weight of what we had brought home felt ungrateful. I went back to Paris Island in 1987, 45 years after I'd gone through boot camp there. I stood on the parade deck where my drill instructor had first assessed us as the most pathetic collection of civilians he had ever been insulted by having to train. I watched a class of new recruits moving through an exercise, and I thought about what I know now that I didn't know when I was 17, that what happens on that ground in those weeks is not cruelty, and it is not theater. It is the construction of something in a human being that has no peacetime equivalent and no peacetime name, but that has saved American lives in every conflict since the Marine Corps was founded. The Japanese soldiers who wrote home about fighting Marines, and many of them did write home, and many of those letters were captured and translated, described something specific. They described the experience of inflicting losses on a Marine unit and watching the unit continue to advance. They described the psychological effect of an enemy who seemed to treat casualties as a tactical inconvenience rather than a reason to stop. They wrote about it with a mixture of frustration and respect that I find, across all the decades, deeply moving. Because they were not wrong, and they were not wrong in a way that was not about American superiority. It was about American training. It was about what 11 weeks on a barrier island in South Carolina could build in a 17-year-old boy from a small town. What the Japanese military hated about fighting Marines was not that we were braver than their soldiers. Their soldiers were among the bravest men I ever encountered. What they hated was that we were relentless in a way that seemed to have no bottom. Every calculation they made about when we would stop was wrong, because we had been trained past the point where stopping was a calculation. We did not stop because stopping had been removed from the available options at Paris Island in 1942 by men with campaign covers and voices that carried across a parade ground and absolute certainty about what they were building. I am 99 years old. My hands shake. I need help getting up from a chair. The hearing in my left ear has been gone since Peleliu, a mortar round that landed close enough to rearrange several things permanently. The island is still in me. All 3 islands are still in me. They will be in me until I'm done. To the men I served with, to the men of the 1st Marine Division, on Guadalcanal, on Peleliu, on Okinawa, to Washington Beaumont, who crossed a 40-yard defile on Peleliu because Lieutenant Briggs said smoke and grenades, 40 seconds, and that was sufficient instruction. To every man who went down and every man who kept moving after the man next to him went down. This was your story. You were not myths. You were not recruiting posters. You were young men from South Carolina and Georgia and Brooklyn and Iowa and California who had been built into something the world had not seen before and has not fully seen since. The Japanese military studied the United States Marine Corps extensively before the war. They read the histories. They analyzed the tactics, they understood the weapons, and still, island after island after island, the calculation was wrong. Because there are things that do not appear in histories and cannot be analyzed from the outside. There are things that only exist in the space between a drill instructor and a recruit on a South Carolina parade deck at 5 in the morning, and they cannot be measured until someone shoots at the man that space produced. And then the measurement is immediate, and the answer is always the same. Semper fidelis, always faithful, always, no matter what.